Hello, everyone.
Yeah.
You're joining with another episode today. I have Sritama Chatterjee, a PhD student at the Department of English, University of Pittsburgh, USA. Sritama is like who I call Shri, is somebody that I've been longing to have in the podcast for the longest time, and finally she's in India, and we are happy to have you here, Sritama. How's it going for you, just to start the conversation?
It's going fine. I am an international student, and I was out of the country for almost 1.5 years. So it's finally great to be back in home
Mhm,
because I think that unless you are in touch with the communities that you write about,
mhm,
it kind of impacts the way you write and think. So it's very
mhm,
important to me,
mhm,
for
mhm,
me, to be back home at least once a year. And
mhm,
finally, I'm just glad to be here. And thank you
mhm.
for inviting me on this show. I really appreciate the space for having an open conversation of things that really matter and things that I really care about. Research, writing, teaching. Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. We'll start talking about the humanities by sort of tracing your trajectory of work, your research.
Yeah.
You basically research on water, on archives, and post-colonialisms. As far as I know, let's talk in detail about how you do your research, how you navigate. What inspired you to work on water in the first place?
Yes. Well, if I have to talk about my research on water, I have to go backwards to almost 5 years ago when I was an MA student at Jadavpur University in Kolkata. And in the final semester, we had a core class which was on postcolonial studies.
Mhm,
And at that time, the things have changed a bit now.
mhm,
The rule was, or the curriculum required, that we write a dissertation, a kind of thesis
mhm.
for our postcolonial studies class. So there were everybody writing a dissertation on postcolonial studies,
For
which
that
was a
class
little
only.
bizarre.
It was for
For
that
that
class
class
only.
only.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
for that class only, which was a little bizarre. But that's
Yeah.
something I've always
Mm,
been
mm,
interested in.
mm, mm,
So it was not so much a problem for me.
mm,
And then I
mm,
started thinking about what are the areas that I really like, what are the areas that I care about.
mm,
And in the semester before, I had actually taken a class on literatures of Australia, New Zealand, and South Pacific. And
mhm,
one of the things that I had noted when I took that class was this constant presence of the ocean and
mhm,
talking about littoral communities and why the ocean matters so
mm,
much.
mhm,
Um, I did not write anything about ocean or water for that class, but it really got me thinking into the fact that when we talk about the nation state, the idea is so much landed and
mhm,
not so much watered, whether we talk about the ocean or even when we're talking about inland water. And that really got me interested, that really got me hooked on to the topic. And then when it was time for me to start thinking about my MA thesis, I did a little bit of research and started looking into what are the already available sources and texts that's available. And one of the first texts that I read was Oshin Dasgupta's book on the Indian Ocean.
mhm,
And it was more about, economics. It was more about, commercial capitalism and racial capitalism in the Indian Ocean.
mhm,
But it got me interested. It brought me into Indian Ocean studies.
mhm,
So the other interlocutors whose work I was interested in was also definitely Sugata Bose, who wrote about and Sugata Bose. What's interesting is that um, even when he's writing about history, he does bring into conversation literary texts,
mhm,
which I think is really interesting as to be doing as a history.
mhm,
And so the MA thesis that I basically wrote was trying to sort of see was trying to sort of understand the sea as this very complex space of what it means to be on board in the ship,
mhm,
and what does the ship as a chronotop means for understanding narrative. So what do I write about? Do I write about coastal communities? But so I focused more on understanding life on the ship itself. So the ship was kind of a narrative device and, let's say, an aesthetic medium that kind of structured and shaped my MA work, which was on, Olivado Equano's slave narrative and Amitabh Ghosh's Sea of Poppies. So it was also trying to connect the Atlantic walls and the Indian Ocean walls. Now that I look back, Equano's text was written way earlier, and Ghosh's text is much more recent. So I think that what I could do differently if I was writing that thesis now was handling this question of scale well, because I was really trying to sort of work with a large time frame. And I think when you work with such large time frame, it requires you to be more careful about method, about narrative, about how you write about that itself, which I don't think I was very careful about. But sort of if I have to correct that now, that's something I would like to do. So I graduated with my MA, and then I took my admission in MPhil in Jadavpur again. But I continued thinking about this topic. Okay. It was still there in the back of my mind for a semester of coursework. And then something really happened in Jadavpur, which I think sort of changed my intellectual trajectory to thinking about oceans and water. GYAN, so the global network of academicians, was a project that was opened by the MHRD ministry, and they sort of invited proposals from faculty members so that they could bring in one faculty from overseas, and there could be a workshop kind of a thing for a week or so. And one of the things that happened in 2016 in Jadavpur was a workshop on environmental humanities. And Stephen Moeke, who's in Australia now, was and also works on Indian Ocean Studies and an anthropologist by training, was one of the co-instructors of that workshop, along with two other fantastic oceanographers, Shugato Hajra, who's also in Jadavpur and has worked extensively in the Indian Ocean. So then when I came in conversation with anthropologists, with oceanographers, I realized that, my work on the Indian Ocean has been so anthropocentric, that I have been talking about people and the ocean, which is important, but I'm not looking at the ocean as what it is, as a medium in itself, as a form of matter in itself.
Right.
And I think that because I hung out with oceanographers for a while, it sort of changed the way I think about water as a medium and water as a form.
Right.
So very recently, a book came out from Duke University Press, a fantastic book called Melody Dew's Wild Blue Media, that thinks about not the surface of the water, but thinks about the water column, the different zones that are present within the water itself. Things about depth, things about surface. But I'm like, this is something that I have started thinking from 2016 when I started talking about oceanographers. But still, I think I guess what I'm trying to say is that slowly I started getting immersed into environmental humanities as a discipline, as a field of legitimate inquiry itself, because it was still in its earliest, sort of formative stages in India back in 2016. Now, of course, the situation has changed a little bit. So when that happened, I started thinking about, okay, I cannot handle such a large scale project for my MPhil again. How do I narrow down? So as part of that, class itself, we were taken to field visits in River Hooghly in Kolkata. And I got really interested in looking at the history of the river. And not just representations, but wanting to see that how the River Hooghly during a certain period of time, from 1870 to 1920, kind of acted as a vehicle for imperial governance by the British government in India. So it was sort of making my foray into, let's say, environmental history, though I was trained as a literary studies scholar. So it was a huge methodological leap that I made while being in an English department. And I'm grateful that, my department, which was an English department, was receptive to this kind of projects, or else it wouldn't have happened. And then when I got into it, the questions with which I came at how it was possible. And one of the ways was to look at very old maps of the river and the infrastructural changes that was made in the river itself to ensure that it flows in a specific direction, and what that means for navigation, what that means for control, what that means for territorialization. I was also looking into the work of, at that time, so that's how I started thinking about River Hooghly. And then I moved within the River Hooghly itself, sort of the narratives of of river pilots who are a different category from ship captains. So when a ship is moving from the river to the sea, there is a space which is really dangerous, and that ship pilots cannot navigate on their own. And you need the support of those river pilots who are trained in handling that transition. And all these pilots came from a very specific school in basically in UK called the Conways, HMS Conways and Cadets. And they had their own house magazine. So when they were posted in India, they were writing letters, they were writing great accounts of the city, and sort of sending it to this house magazine called the Cadets of HMS Conways. And I think there's very little work that actually done on the river pilots, and that also really got me started thinking about how do there's so much said, done, written about colonial Kolkata, about river, about 19th century. How is it that I've never really come across an account of these river pilots? So that's how I started sort of charting my dissertation around thinking about the water, thinking about the river in terms of not just the ship, which I had earlier worked on, but very much in terms of how water itself was a vehicle of colonialism in India, and how it sort of has changed, transformed, basically altered by post-colonial regimes in India too, and in what ways the trajectories are same, in what way the trajectories are different. So this was what I did for my MPhil. Please stop me because I think I am talking for a long time now. And then I moved into proposing my MPhil PhD. So as you know that in PhD, the way it works in the US is that we do coursework for the first 2 years or for first 3 years, and then we take an exam, and then we finally propose our topic. So I guess I am in the in the comprehensive exam stage right now, where I'm definitely working on a project, but it might take some shape for my PhD project. But right now, I think the question that I'm trying to think for my project is that how does Indian Ocean studies shape our understanding of post-colonial Anthropocene? So that's if one asks me that what is my current question for my project now, that's my question. In what ways Indian Ocean studies can shift, redefine, modify the way we think about this very vast terms, post-coloniality and Anthropocene? Because I think that there are scholars like Elizabeth Dulugri, Rob Nixon, Isabel Hofmeyr, who has talked about post-colonial Anthropocene, but I think that we can take it further ahead if we can bring Indian Ocean studies in conversation with oceanography and also legal studies. There's a lot of work that can be done there. And I think that's what I'm really interested in, because the understanding of the way law works on the surface of the sea changes when you reach the bottom of the sea. And I think that can give you a totally different light of thinking about law on the sea itself, from the surface to the depth. And then also you have oceanographers, because I think that history, science, and technology is a very emerging discipline that I'm really interested in. And I think that, as post-colonial studies scholars, we need to be having some kind of interaction with them without forgetting our own disciplinary training, which I think is really important. So I guess that's where I am at, and trying to think more about history of oceanography and also legal studies in Indian Ocean.
That's wonderful and very refreshing to hear your trajectory of research, your work. I guess in Sri Lanka, in English departments, studies on water and archives has not yet been, a focus. And I guess this would be a very refreshing insight into how people can work with this. You're also into a lot of public writing. I saw you first time when I saw your writing on different platforms. How has public writing shaped your trajectory of work? Is it that public writing has sort of shaped it, or your work as an academic has shaped your public writing? How do you navigate between those two terrains?
It's a very important and interesting question, and I think it will help me to think about a lot of things that I've been wondering about. So, when I start thinking about public writing, the first public piece that I ever wrote was back in 2015. So when I was working for my MPhil, I was also simultaneously working in a sort of multi-institutional research project on online learning called Equal. And as part of Equal, there was a bi-monthly newsletter that we used to publish. Sometimes I have issued some of the late issues of that newsletter myself. But in one of the early issues, I wrote something about knowledge commons, which is coming to use for me right now, because the ocean has considered a commons, and how that can shift our understanding of Anthropocene. I thought that very recently, but I initially started writing for a more public audience by thinking about open access and knowledge commons. I think that there has been a lot of cross-pollination between the kind of writing that I do for a more general audience, and the kind of writing that we are often required to do in academia. And the way I see it is that the schism that is often made between public scholarship and academic writing is probably not there as much as one would like to think. Yes, citation practices are different. Sometimes there is an assumption that when you're writing for an audience that's not enough familiar with your field, you cannot write in jargons, or you have to be more. But at the end of the day, I think all writing is about telling stories. It's about narrative, and it's up to you about how you tell the story. I definitely think that because when I was writing for a public audience, I was thinking about stories and how you tell a story that would immediately grip the audience. Similarly, when I have been writing my, research papers or essays, I try to think about how those same ways of telling story, of being specific and not being vague, because I think clarity is the touchstone of any good writing, whether you're an academic or otherwise. Then it kind of opens up possibilities for incorporating nuances, and for incorporating arguments and ideas that you haven't thought of before. So I think there is really any schism between this, as one would like to think. I would actually like to refer to a debate that's going on. I haven't read the book yet. So Rita Felsky, whom I really, really admire as a scholar, and I think that her book on post critique is really important.
Mhm.
She has recently published a book. I forget the name again, but I'll get back to you in a while. In which she kind of dismisses scholars and literary historians who write for public outlets such as public books or LARB, and she calls them something like paracritics, that they are not. She does acknowledge that it offers them space for experimentation,
Mhm.
but they're not really critics because they're not writing for critical inquiry, but they're writing for public books.
Mhm.
So, and Sheila Liming, who actually wrote a response to that book, recently reviewed the book, had a very interesting thing to say, is that when you have been part of an institution for a long time, you do not even realize how the institution kind of you are become co-opted in the structure of the
Mhm.
institution itself. So I think much of this debate between public scholarship and the writing that we do for journals is actually what the institution makes us to believe that it actually exists, but it probably doesn't exist as one would like to think.
Mhm.
Yes. So that's what I started with. But then I think to refer back to my own trajectory of public writing is that I started it as early as 2015, when I was writing about knowledge commons, when I was writing about environmental humanities as emerging as an emerging field that has got very exciting prospects.
Mhm.
Um, there was a long period of time when I wasn't writing for a public audience, and I think that that didn't help me to to write better for my own essays and stuff. So when I joined grad school, I think one of the commitments that I made to myself is that I'm going to write for an audience, because it's a good practice to be constantly in touch with your own writing and research, and it's also about how you tell the same story to different people.
Mhm.
So when you know how to tell the same story to different people, it gives you more clarity about what each of these versions of storytelling can generate.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then when you're writing, you could choose which storytelling fits you the most.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's how I see it. And I also think that for so a lot of my public writing is also about pedagogy issues.
Yeah.
And I think that when I'm writing about pedagogy issues, mostly what I have done, I haven't sort of explored the more conceptual and philosophical dimensions of my pedagogy. I mean, I have in my brain, but I haven't really put it out in public yet. Because when I do public-based, pedagogy writing, it's more practical, it's more on
Mhm.
point. Um,
Mhm.
but someday, if I get space, I think that I'm going to write a more longer form pedagogy piece that also incorporates my philosophy.
Mhm.
But hopefully that will have happen, but it hasn't happened yet.
Mhm.
So, and this is something, and this is a practice that I would really like to continue, because I feel that it has allowed me to connect with more people, people who are interested in my work. You got to know me through public rating,
Mhm.
and also to really understand what matters to me the most. What is it that I care for about? What is a story that I would want to tell to a broader audience?
Mhm.
Because my advisor told me something really important, is that a good book is an interdisciplinary book, but you don't
Mhm.
forget your own discipline when you write that book.
Mhm.
And to be to be able to be a good interdisciplinary scholar, you need to tell stories to different people. And public writing trains you in telling those stories in a
Mhm.
beautiful manner.
Mhm. Absolutely. You're also an activist. You're so you're so how should I put this? Like even if you're at an institutional context, I think you do not let sometimes it define you, the way you think, the way you want to navigate the politics, etc. How do you work with your activist probably your activist endeavors, especially when it comes to an institutional context? For example, you're a PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh, at a department, and sometimes you may have to be bound by certain, certain unwritten protocols. But what are the perks? Oh, I don't know. Just tell us, how do you navigate these waters?
You know, it's an
Waters
interesting
again.
question. So, it's a funny question too.
Mm,
So I think the institutions where I studied in India, they have been sort of central to how I think about politics.
mhm,
And I think I am somebody who truly believes in a very radical left politics.
mm,
And I think that, having said at the same time that radical left politics is some ways about mastery. So
mm,
even though I'm steeped in the tradition of radical left politics, my way to understanding activism is to sort of embrace unmastery, because when you embrace unmastery, then you not only take up space, but you also create space for others. So the way I have always understood activism of any kind is to take up space and to make space for others.
mhm,
So, so in some ways, I guess when I came to US, I think one of the things that I have been very aware of is that I am a worker, because the scholarship, the money that I get, is because the labor that I put in, right? And institutions often do not recognize PhD students as workers or
mm,
as laborers, which I think is so problematic. And for the last few years, there have been union organizing that's going on at Pitt. We don't have a union yet.
mhm,
I have been active for a long time. It's only in the last couple of months that I have distanced myself from union organizing at Pitt for various reasons. But I continue to be a fervid believe in unions and what unions can do for international students in the US,
mhm,
and also like having a say in your workplace conditions. Um, so I think so. For instance, if there's no union, you are literally you're literally dependent on the institutions to give you a raise.
yeah.
But if you have a union and you can bargain, then you know that it's a part of the contract, and that's something you have to do. So having a union enables you to have a say in your workplace conditions, and that I think is so important.
Mhm,
So I think that's the so I think the two things that I definitely care a lot is thinking of graduate students as graduate workers,
mhm,
and obviously a sort of anti-fascist struggle that we need to be building, not just in India but also globally.
mhm,
um, because with the situation in my country and also in other parts of the world, you talk about Brazil, US still a couple of months ago was so bad that you need this global solidarity and you need this global struggle. And so one way is to take space, and another way is to create space, and the other way is how do you sort of connect this different kind of struggles, how do you connect these different types of mobilizations that have been going on. And I have to say that I have learned a lot from community organizers, from environmental advocate organizers in Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh has a very long history of unionizing. It
mhm,
also is very active when it comes to water activism. And there is something truly that you can really sit, watch back and learn from them. You cannot always apply all of this in India, it's not possible, but there is indeed a lot that you can learn. But I think that the most important activism that happens for me is definitely inside the classroom.
mhm,
Because I remember once telling someone, because Jadavpur is known for its politics and for struggles. A neighbor once told me, "Oh, you're always involved in politics. Do you even do class?" I'm like, you know what? The politics happens inside the classroom, and this is something I truly believe in.
mhm,
So for me, one of the ways of carrying out this activism and advocacy is inside the space of the classroom.
Mhm.
It's not that I always make it clear to my students, but my students definitely get it. So for instance, this semester I taught a class on global environmental justice, and I think my two agendas was to think about systemic structures um, that's responsible for climate justice, which needs, and there needs to be a shift from individual action and what I can do as an individual, which I think is important, but we need to think about structural points, structural systems, basically. And I think that is really important for me. And the second thing being, when you are a woman of color in the US and you're teaching about race, amidst other things, and gender and sexuality, you are seen from a certain perspective. So how do you, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that how do you talk about these things with students who have probably never have had any exposure to it because their curriculum was so white when they were in K-12? Um, and it's very likely that I'm the only instructor of color that they have ever had. So having this conversation with them can be precarious, can make you feel precarious at times. But nevertheless, it's important to have these conversations, And many a times I've heard, and there are a lot of good things that I've learned about pedagogy from the US. But I think one thing is that it's not your responsibility to care about student politics. And I'm like, well, but if somebody is racist, then that is racist. And you have to point that to students and say, you are being racist, but in what ways do you do that? So there are ways to do that. So I think there are challenges to the process, but you need to think, at least for me, I really think of the classroom as a very politically challenging activist space. Yeah.
On that note, we will talk about your curriculum, the recent grant that you've received to design a module on digital transgender archives. Let's talk about how that happened and your other engagements, especially when it comes to preparing curriculum.
Yes. So I think when I was in Jadavpur in 2016, I worked as part of a project called Equal from 2016 to 2017. And one of the things that we were doing as part of this multi-institutional project was creating online courses. And I was a researcher for it. I was looking at the courses that are available, what they have, how we can do things differently. So I've been somebody who have been interested in online learning. And so last summer, what happened was PIT received a grant from the Mellon Foundation, which was called Humanities Engage, about rethinking the curriculum of doctoral education recently. And as part of that grant, one of the things that they opened up was that you can collaborate with an instructor to be creating a digital collection-based module. So I would have been normally teaching in fall anyway. So I started thinking about, who's someone I can really reach out to and I know will support me, will help me grow. And then I thought about Dr. Julie Bulio. So Dr. Julie Bulio is a full-time lecturer in the PSWS, the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program in University of Pittsburgh. And she teaches classes in archival studies, in transgender studies, and sexuality studies. And when I reached out to Julie, the first thing that I said was, I know that you're teaching an archival studies class and you got a grant for it, but just can I assist you in building some kind of a module for that class? And she said me something important. She said, if you have to get this grant, you cannot already work on a course that has a strong archival component already built. I'm also teaching transgender studies class. I'm also teaching this class, which are the other classes, which do not have an archival component yet, that you would like to assist me. I said, okay, I think I'm interested in the transgender studies class. So that's how my collaboration with Julie Video started. I submitted an application and I got it. So I think while developing, so this was a class that was taken by a number of gender studies majors, but also some people who just took it for an ED. So there was a wide combination of students to work with. And so initially, if this was in person, it would have happened very differently. But because it was an online class, I think one of the things is to sort of introduce the students to the challenges of doing digital archival histories, the potential, the limits, the utilities, and archives can be overwhelming, frankly, because there's just too much going on. So how do you sort of narrow down from that very broad understanding of archives? And excuse me, so Julie told me something that, how about you focus on one specific collection and then sort of show your method of working with archival sources, so that then that is something that students can learn from. And one of the magazines that I was really interested in is Fanfare magazine that was published from South Africa from 1980s and 1990s. Can you just take a quick hydration break?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I guess one of the things that so there were basically two challenges when we were working on this curriculum development grant. One is to how do you sort of engage students with understanding the global dimensions of trans studies? And the second thing was, when you have a vast array of resources like this, how do you sort of narrow it down? And then Julie told me something really important. She told me, how about you choose one magazine that you think you're really interested in, show them your process, so that that is something that they can again use in other contexts and other ways when they're doing their own research. And one magazine that I thought was of great interest to me was the Fanfare magazine that was published in 1980s and early 1990s from South Africa. And I sort of focused on the letters that were published in those magazines for a period of time. So these letters were letters that are written by family members. These letters often are a kind of criticism of the kind of cartoons that have been published in the magazines. These letters were also sometimes basically criticizing. Just hold on a second. Yes.
Yeah.
So these letters were also sometimes written by members who did not approve of some of the policies of the magazine, like having a meeting that was inaccessible to a larger population of time. And through the letters, one of the ways that I wanted to talk with or discuss with is that archives are a space of trauma in many ways. And there are obviously limitations to archival research, but how can you think of archives as spaces of joy, as spaces of radical hope, radical solidarity, as spaces of world making? So it was a shift from understanding what is not there in the archives as loss, archives as trauma, which are all valid approaches, to shifting to thinking of archives as joy and archives as spaces of friendship, and how does that happen? And the ways to think about it was through letters.
Okay.
And again, when you are talking about the global dimensions of trans histories, as a cisgender woman, I think one of the things that I was thinking about is to how we are not masters of the material that we are working with, but we are really listening to what is happening in the archives and trying to make sense of this huge amount of experiences that are present within it. And when you say it's from a different context or it's from a different culture, students can build up a resistance that, it's not my culture, it's not my space to say. But you are talking about global, but you are shifting from a more cross-cultural understanding of global to a more historical understanding of global. And that kind of brings in students to understanding trans histories. and doing archival work and archival research. So initially, what I did was, develop a tour of digital transgender archives, giving them an introduction of what we are going to do in the units itself. But in the synchronous sessions that we had, we basically spent time working independently through, browsing Fanfare magazine, through browsing the digital transgender archives, and sort of also coming up their own reviews of what an archive can do, and the potential ways for it to grow. So it was really an introductory kind of a unit for them. But for me as an instructor who sort of collaborated with Dr. Video to incorporate this, it made me think about that we are often on the user end of using digital archives. But the process of creating an archive is also about what goes in, what goes in out. How do you present this? In what ways do you present it? Metadata, etc. And I think that in the future, if I ever have an opportunity to teach an archival course where I can include archival component, my idea is to sort of build a semester-long archival project, and rather than being the end user, you participate in creating an archive with an active goal. So making that shift, I think, is really important for me.
That's wonderful to hear. How was the shift from doing environmental humanities into a component in transgender studies made you feel like as a scholar? How was that engagement?
It's a good question. So when I was in my first year of a PhD, I had a friend whom I wouldn't name without her permission. She was someone who's really interested in climate change and trans justice. And I know that, in some ways, the various conversations that I've had with her made me really aware of how it is really difficult to find an archive where trans studies explicitly talks about environmental humanities, right? And even when I was developing this curriculum, I had a conversation with her, and she said, "There's none that I know of." And then what happened was, initially when I started looking at this project, I started thinking about it more in terms of how do you bring environmental humanities and conversation with trans histories. I wasn't really able to find a direct connection in the digital transgender archives itself, but I got hold of other, magazines that does talk about that. That is not saying I'm talking about environmental humanities, but it talks about, let's say, the connection with the soil, the connection with the earth, the connection with the water. So you really have to look carefully. So if you Google search environmental humanities and trans studies, you probably would find very less materials. But if you look carefully through these materials and see what's there, and you see these references, which are a little bit very brief, but I think are important in their own ways, in their own rights. So it was not so much a shift. I would rather reframe it as sort of bringing environmental humanities in conversation with trans studies, which did not happen in the module itself. Something that I'm really interested in thinking more about, even in the context of my own work, because I think there's a lot of potential. Maybe not for my desk project. I don't have to do everything in one project. But something I'm really I keep thinking a lot about. I don't have an answer to that yet, but I think it could open up very potential areas, that because I think that if you can't talk about climate justice without talking about trans justice.
Absolutely.
And I'm pretty sure that there have been predecessors in ways that we haven't thought before. And it's also about making these connections and making this draws. You might not find everything in one place, so you have to look up other places and other ways of connecting the dots.
Great. To wrap up our conversation, I would like to shift our focus, not so much a shift, but talk about the humanities and how important is good curriculum building, mentorship, and pedagogy for the humanities. especially in the context where we globally face institutional and intellectual neglect as a field of inquiry. So, what do you think about that?
I think I'll start with the last aspect about mentorship and then sort of go back
Yeah,
to it.
yeah.
I think that there needs to be a shift in the model of mentorship from a more vertical model where you have somebody, like a kind of supervising you and seeing what you're doing all the time, to a horizontal mentorship where you have your comrades side by side. So think about it, so Brown, the Bigger Six Romantics, who are a collective of, scholars who work on romantic studies. They had this beautiful line in their manifesto, which I thought was like, it's about standing in a circle and you're looking outside, but to reimagine humanities, rather, you have to stand there in a circle
Mm-hmm.
and look at each other
Mm-hmm.
and sort of make that solidarity building. So I think mentorship from a more vertical model to a horizontal model where you have a network of peer mentors, where you have where you really invite graduate students, where you invite even activists, who are even people who are not part of academia, to be a part of this conversation. You don't have to have a mentor who's in academia. You can have a mentor who's not connected to academia at
Absolutely.
all, and then keep the conversation going, because that then keeps us grounded. um, as far as curriculum development is concerned, I think, I'm somebody who has really benefited from the public university system in the US, and from in India, not in the US. Oh my God, in India. And I think that the public university system in India, because of education, it has helped me grow through three basic things. One is, how do you ask good questions? How do you read and interpret texts? And how do you connect what you are reading with the world outside? And any curriculum development, no matter, you can introduce fancy texts, you can introduce fancy subjects, you can introduce fancy courses, but if they're not cognizant of this three basic question, who is this course for? How do we teach them to read and write? How do we teach them to ask questions? How do we teach them to connect the world that we are a part of, and connecting it with what we are reading? Then curriculum development cannot be successful.
Mm-hmm.
So being cognizant of these three questions, and I think is kind of really important. And I think, as far as the question of mentorships is concerned, I think it's really important that you seek out people from outside your discipline too, or else it's very hard for people. You get ghettoized in your own little space, in your own little bubble, and you don't know what you are doing. So you need somebody to point out. If you I know that this is going to happen for me when I go out to the bazaar in India, and if someone asks me, what do you work on? If I'm not able to summarize or say this person in two lines of this is what I work on, and this is why, this is what it matters, and this is why you should be interested in, then probably I haven't thought about carefully about how do you talk about that subjects to people who are an informed individual nevertheless, but not doesn't know anything about academia or about your discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So I think being cognizant of these three questions and thinking about mentorship as a form of labor again, and to sort of visibilize those labor, because I think a lot of time we engage in mentorship but we do not make it visible.
Mm-hmm.
But institutions will take mentorship visible only when we make them more visible.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's also the question of what we are visibilizing and in what ways are we visibilizing. that's
Absolutely.
that's my that's my that's my answer to it. I think it's really important to teach students how to ask good question, and I think that was a training that I had,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what I try with my own students too, to ask them, to make them ask good questions. It's okay if we don't have answers to all of them.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Before wrapping up, is there any final remark that you would like to add? Any comment on anything that I couldn't ask you? If
No,
because
I think
our
I
time.
think the questions were great, especially the question about thinking about how public writing has inspired, influenced my academic scholarship, and also the question about activist and why is curriculum development, research and teaching and mentorship so important for humanities is something that I think we will not have all answers yet, but we do need to keep asking those questions so that it never falls out of the loop. I think it's also important to kind of stop defending the humanities all the time. Like, humanities will not die. We need to defend humanity for reasons X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, if people don't want to be convinced, it's not your job to convince. It's one thing to
Absolutely.
say, oh, humanities does this, and to do the work.
Mm.
But, rather than saying humanities does X, Y, Z, I would rather do the work.
Mm.
That itself will show that why humanities matters, rather than saying humanities matters, X, Y, and Z. So I think there is a shift that we need to make. And I think that I really like the provocative title of the podcast of Who's Afraid of the Humanities, because I think that um, there is no clear answer to that question,
No
but
clear answer.
probably one of them. There's no clear answer. But I think it's a provocative question.
Thank you, Shri. Thank you for joining with us today.
This conversation.
This is something that really wanted to have this. I really wanted to have this conversation with you for the longest time, like I said before. And I'm so fortunate that I was able to talk to you today. And I wish you all the best with every your research, your activist your activist your how should I say that engagements, your classwork, your engagement with students. Everything that you do has been very inspiring. I wish you all the best, and I hope this will be a very refreshing episode for a lot of people, because the ways of thinking about the humanities within and outside of it is not just about being stuck in one bubble. Like you said, it's about reaching out, exploring your possibilities with other disciplines and bringing them into conversation as well. Thank you, Shri. Have a nice day.
You too.